In September of 1994, SNK released its Neo Geo CD to the Japanese marketplace. On paper, it had been a brilliant idea. With CD-based software, they would be able to bring home arcade titles at a much more reasonable price than what it had offered before. Most games were now $50 and $60, a far cry from the $200 cartridges for the AES. This unit used a motorized front-loading tray for the CD-ROM and retailed for a bit less than $500. SNK also completely rethought its controller for the Neo Geo CD. Instead of including the classic arcade stick we had seen for years, they made a more console-oriented pad, complete with 4 action buttons, a select and a start, as well as a directional nub that used micro switches. While all this was seemingly a surefire home run for SNK to get more Neo Geo machines and software into people's homes, the bad press began almost immediately. Gaming magazines brought up its slow load times before the hardware even launched, and when the reviews came in, they were further critical of the device and its aging two-dimensional sprite-based technology. SNK was quick to release a cheaper top-loading unit shortly after launch to help alleviate the negativity, but it too had the same issues with slow load times. This led to an absolute cratering of consumer interest and ultimately the platform's demise less than 3 years later. As time went on, it was remembered as the red-headed stepchild of the Neo Geo family, and the harsh criticism never really let up. Back in those days, I had my hands full with the Saturn, PlayStation, and Nintendo 64, so my only exposure to the Neo Geo CD was through a friend and his limited library. In this episode, join me as I take a closer look at the Neo Geo CD, some of its games, and see if that talk of intolerable load times has any real merit. I hope you guys enjoy. Was the Neo Geo CD really that bad? When the Neo Geo CD launched in September of 1994, it had an impressive 21 titles that accompanied it. SNK did a great job of mixing up the available genres as well. There were fighters like Fatal Fury Special and Samurai Showdown, shoot-em-ups like Aero Fighters 2 and Last Resort, action games like Magician Lord and Blues Journey, and the games kept on coming. As each month hit, a new batch of titles were released, leading to dozens of options in a pretty short amount of time. But I quickly learned that the quality of these experiences varied quite a bit. For instance, throw in a game like League Bowling. There are literally no load times after the initial boot up. It wasn't much different from the cartridge version, honestly, and I found this to be the case for a number of other games as well. Load times just didn't factor in very heavily. Whether it was a sports offering like Baseball Stars 2 or even beat-em-ups like Burning Fight, the load times were nothing close to being unbearable. I mean, what the heck was everyone talking about? Well, I soon found out the answer to that question with a little bit of testing. As I mentioned before, League Bowling here has no issues at all when it comes to load times. After it loads initially, that's all you'll see of that little monkey. The cartridge version of this was a tiny 26 megabits, so the Neo Geo CD can literally load the entire thing in one go. I always liked this game despite its simple premise, and the Neo CD plays it just fine. Magician Lord is another early game that seems to load up all at once. At 46 megs, it doesn't have any trouble fitting into the Neo Geo CD's massive pool of memory. The resulting action on the Neo Geo CD does not suffer any debilitating load times and plays fantastic. This game was a showpiece title back at its release, and it's still a looker all these years later. Ghost Pilots was 55 megabits and again, no problematic load times past the opening. It seemingly moves from stage to boss and on to the next area without much of a hitch at all. The 2-player mode is intact in how this one should be played. The 50 megs of Baseball Stars Professional looks, sounds, and plays perfectly. After the startup load, you play the entire game without interruptions. No matter if it's when switching sides, getting a home run cinematic, or celebrating a victory, the Neo Geo CD has no issues with this one at all.
Get the homer out of here. The crowd is going crazy. And as he rounds the bases, he loves to egg that crowd on. And proud he should be. He hit that ball a country mile. He just loves to hit homers here in this park.
Moving up in size, the 74 megabit Sengoku 2 introduces our first real noticeable gameplay hitch, though it's nothing alarming. The game has a tolerable opening load screen, though you will notice when you switch scenes, there is a slight pause as the soundtrack changes and the new background comes in. It isn't something that I'd call a negative, but more of something you are aware of each time it happens. Great game this one, and the Neo CD plays it just fine. Moving along, we try out Samurai Showdown and its 118 megs of explosive one-on-one action. This loads at the start and in between each round, but these load times are not egregious in the slightest. They are really no longer than the load times you experienced on the Saturn and PlayStation. This classic is spot on incredible, and one of the few fighters back then I considered to be just as good as Street Fighter II. If you have a Neo CD, fear not, it's a great purchase there as well. Our first test batch ends with Galaxy Fight. This AI is so aggressive and difficult even on the lowest setting, it's unbelievable that anyone could ever get any good at it. Load times here start out pretty long, and you even need a load screen to see the attract mode. I still wouldn't call those load times unacceptable, however. They're there and noticeable, but easily dealt with. After doing some testing, it was clear that the original size of the cartridge made a huge difference in the Neo Geo CD experience. Smaller games released in the first few years of the Neo Geo's life tended to play great, with load times that really didn't interfere much with the overall experience. As the games got bigger, there seemed to be some pretty significant load times associated with it. It was also becoming apparent that fighting games were at the heart of the worst load times I had encountered so far. That gave me the motivation to break out some of the Neo Geo's largest games in terms of cartridge size that had been converted to CD. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of those. We are going to start with the modest 202 megabits of Samurai Showdown 2, one of the very best games for the entire platform. And just like the first, the Neo Geo CD seems to handle things here quite well. You do get the opening load screen that's fairly long, but the in-between rounds loading seems about on par with other CD-ROM based platforms, plus a couple of extra seconds here and there. I was able to play through the game without much problems though, so let's move up a bit and see what changes. The 539 megabits of Real Bout Fatal Fury 2 was an eye-opener. This sucker had a sizable load at start. It needed to load the opening animations, the opening attract screen, and a huge load time in between fights. The load times were not game-breaking, but they certainly got tiresome really fast. I can see the fatigue of trying to play the entire game with these types of waits just being unbearable. I wanted to see more, however, so let's keep on trucking. The original Metal Slug was a mere 193 megs, and you only needed to worry about the loading in between levels. Those load times are tolerable and not really any worse than what we saw in the Saturn port of the game. It's here that I'm really starting to see that the type of game makes a tremendous difference. When talking a game with levels like run and guns or beat 'em ups, the gameplay in between the loading makes a massive difference. It made things infinitely more tolerable because you got to play much longer in between the load times. So let's move on and see if that continues to be the case. While we are on this kick, let's go ahead and take a look at the Neo Geo CD exclusive Cross Swords 2. This third-person action RPG uses real-time battles, different classes of warriors with different abilities, and an upgrade system to improve your stats. I imagine that being designed around the Neo CD really helped with this one, because after the initial load, you really only see loading when you move to a new area, a scant amount of time that really isn't long at all. This one is great with 2 players and a must-have if you plan on supporting a Neo CD. The King of Fighters 98 may well be the best game in that series. It looks incredible and the gameplay is top-tier stuff no matter the platform. It's also 683 megabits, and while I expected the Neo Geo CD load times to be hefty, nothing could have prepared me for just how bad it was. If you play the traditional team-based mode, it loads in between every single round. That's right, round. Beat someone, loading. Lose, loading. A single match can go on for what seems like 10 minutes as the game takes forever to load the assets round to round. To make this worse, sometimes these loading screens come just after a few seconds. Let's say a round was won but your life bar was down to nothing. It loads, then you get waylaid with a quick combo and lose. You are right back to looking at a long load screen again immediately. There is a single mode that helps alleviate some of this, but as far as the traditional experience, this one is about as bad as it gets on the Neo Geo CD. When it comes to unique games, it doesn't get much different than Twinkle Star Sprites. This is a versus shoot-'em-up puzzle hybrid where the entire game is all about trying to blow your opponent out of the sky. The cart was only 146 megabits, and the Neo Geo CD handles it well. Matches tend to be fast, but loading never goes overboard and keeps you waiting for very long. It was quite refreshing after my brutal session with the King of Fighters 98. After the second batch of titles, it became absolutely clear to me that fighting games, the Neo Geo's bread and butter, were at the heart of the issues with the loading times. It's true that non-fighting games had some fairly long load times as well, but those tended to be much more tolerable as the play times were so much longer in between them. For example, in something like Sengoku 2, the in-between loading was fairly long, but because the levels themselves were long, it didn't really bog down the action to any meaningful degree. Fighting games, on the other hand, would have matches in the 30 to 60 second range, and then you were looking at a long load time in between every fight, and sometimes in between every round. This impacted the experience far more heavily. The later released fighters were the worst offenders, thanks to their original cartridge sizes being so massive. In our last round of testing here, we will take a look at a completely random sample of titles to see how each one of them fares. NAM 1975's 46 megabits is no issue for the Neo Geo CD. After your initial loading screen, you get pretty much the entire game uninterrupted. Even the storyboards are fully loaded in between the stages. Good 2-player action on this one, and it does just fine on the old Neo CD. I threw in King of the Monsters 2 and gave it a run as well. The 74 megabits of the original cartridge proved no match for the Neo CD. There is some loading in between each area, but this comes fairly quick and the stages are long enough to where you only really see it a handful of times the entire game. The AI here is really unfair, so this is a much better experience with 2 players. Like the other fighting games I've looked at, the 178 megabit Aggressors of Dark Combat has a big loading time in the start and then a more manageable one in between matches. Unfortunately, it also carries a few smaller load times in between things like the win quotes and showing you the next fighter. Not unreasonable, but it does start to wear thin after a handful of matches. The first Art of Fighting was 102 megabits and the Neo Geo CD does an admirable job with it. There is a hefty opening load screen you need to contend with, but after that, the fight transitions are relatively quick. Fortunately, it doesn't need to load for the cinematics, so you don't see the loading nearly as much as you may have initially been led to believe. Ninja Master's 330 megs of power means there's some loading times here that are fairly off-putting. It's not King of Fighters bad, but it's longer than what you may be used to from this era's of CD-ROM technology. There's a big one in the beginning too. Fighting games were without a doubt the most glaring offenders when it came to the Neo CD's load times, and this one was no exception. The nature of WINDJAMMERS gameplay and its relatively smaller cart size of just 74 megabits means that the load times here are no problem at all. After the initial boot up, it's smooth sailing from there on out. Matches themselves have no additional loading at all. It's a great two-player title and a winner on the Neo Geo CD. At a manageable 55 megabits, the Super Spy loads at the start and then pretty much is good to go from there. You think there would be some loading between floors and cinematics, but not so. This is just as playable here as it was on the other Neo Geo form factors. Give it a try, there's nothing quite like it on the platform. Good old Cyberlip is 50 megabits of pure arcade goodness, and because of that, the Neo CD loads it pretty much in a single go, and you'll worry no more about the interruptions. As far as run and guns go, it's quite simple and quaint, but I still enjoyed its boss encounters and two-player action. You absolutely cannot have a Neo Geo episode and not show Neo Turf Masters. Easily my favorite game on the platform, it weighed in at 133 megs in its cartridge form. That means that it should have been an easy one to handle for the Neo Geo CD. Unfortunately, we get a ton of loading here. In between what seems like every cinematic, announcement, stage change, and everything else you can think of, there is a load screen to contend with. Just to see the course records, there's a damn loading screen. It's still playable because none of this loading lasts very long. There's just way too much of it. Great game, but not necessarily the best way to experience it.
Good shot.
46 megabits accounted for all the action in Ninja Combat, and as you would have guessed, the Neo Geo CD loads this one with no problem, and then you're off to the races. It's a run-and-gun, side-scrolling beat-em-up adventure that, while simple, is still a fun ride while it lasts. On the Neo Geo CD, not even the story elements present much in the way of issues as far as loading goes. After it boots up, it's basically the cartridge experience from that point forward. We end our test run with the magnificent SHODOWN Layton Metal Slug 2. This was quite a bit larger in size than the first entry, coming in at 362 megabits. That means it taxes the Neo Geo CD's memory quite a bit more, and you'll see those load screens far more often. Stages that have multiple scenes will stop and load, though those load times are not what I'd call unacceptable. With this being the last of the Metal Slugs on the Neo CD, we never got to see the excellent follow-up that fixes the massive slowdowns that absolutely pounded the gameplay. Still, this is a great game though.
Heavy machine gun.
With sales of the Neo Geo CD basically in the toilet the entire time it was on the market, it only sold a bit over 500,000 units before SNK pulled the plug in 1997 and ended the run. Not even a faster loading version of the hardware released in late 1995, dubbed the CD-Z, could alter its fate. Word of mouth, bad press, and a market that was in love with polygon games had spelled doom for SNK's CD-ROM based Neo Geo. This of course meant that there are many AES and MVS releases that never saw the light of day on the Neo Geo CD. Should you invest in one, be aware that it's missing hits like Waku Waku 7, Shock Troopers, Blazing Star, Ganryu, every Metal Slug after Part 2, Mark of the Wolves, most of the King of Fighters, Samurai Shodown 5, SNK vs. Capcom, and a few other big names that could impact your opinion of it. In the plus column, many CD versions of these games have Red Book audio that sounds quite a bit different from their cartridge counterparts. Some games also have built-in saving and loading options for progress and high score saves. But the overall experience of the Neo Geo CD is definitely one up for discussion. After testing a large portion of the available releases, it became clear that the Neo Geo CD was very much a viable option should you prefer its earlier releases and the non-fighting game library in general. It was mainly the constant loading in between the matches of the fighting genre that really made the Neo Geo CD a tough sell. They came so often in the later releases you never could escape them, sometimes adding a minute or more in between every single fight. The King of Fighters series was by far the worst offender in this regard, with the 3-on-3 teams essentially meaning long loading in between every single round. The CDZ does improve upon some of this, but on the most egregious load times, you still see significant waits that impact your playability. For those curious, there is a mod out there that you can do called the Neo Geo CD SD Loader that allows you to bypass the slow, one-time CD-ROM drive and load games directly from an SD card at 4 times the original speed. This is significantly faster and works with both the front loader and top loader versions of the hardware. This is in effect the great equalizer, correcting the slow loading issue completely. Should you decide to give the Neo Geo CD a chance, keep in mind what we found out in this episode, and you just may come away with a better opinion of one of gaming's most infamous consoles. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.